Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we return with another chilling collection of forgotten accounts buried deep in the shadows of time. In this episode, we will dive deep into the heart of American small towns with 6 harrowing tales of the most disturbing true horror stories that have emerged from these seemingly quiet communities. Each narrative has been meticulously researched and reconstructed from first-hand testimonies of residents who lived through these terrifying experiences in places where everyone knows your name, but nobody knows your secrets. These are the confessions of ordinary people who witnessed extraordinary evil in towns, with populations that could fit in a high school gymnasium. To protect the identities of those involved, some names and locations have been carefully altered, but the core truth of each account remains intact. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for daily true horror content that will keep you questioning what really happens when the sun sets on small-town America. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the darkest files that small communities tried to bury forever. I delivered mail in Millfield for 12 years, and I thought I knew every secret in that town. When you walk the same routes day after day, season after season, you become part of the landscape. People wave from their windows, leave you cold drinks in summer, and shovel paths to their mailboxes in winter. You learn which houses get medical supply deliveries, which ones have college kids coming home, and which ones never seem to get anything but bills and catalogs. But there was something happening on Elm Street that took me 12 years to notice, and another 6 months to understand. Millfield is the kind of place where 3,000 people call home, where Main Street has more empty storefronts than open businesses, and where everyone knows your business before you do. It sits in a valley between 2 hills, surrounded by maple forests that turn the whole town gold every October. The kind of place people drive through on their way to somewhere else, never stopping long enough to see what lurks beneath the surface. My route covered the whole town, but Elm Street was always my favorite. 12 houses lined up in a perfect row, each one built in the 1940s with identical front porches and small front yards. The residents were mostly older folks who had lived there for decades. Mrs. Patterson at number 4 always had her porch light on and would wave from her kitchen window. Mr. Rodriguez at number 8 kept the most immaculate garden I had ever seen. The Hendersons at number 12 had lived there since they were newlyweds in 1963. For 11 years, I delivered their mail without paying much attention to the details. Bills, magazines, the occasional package. Normal small-town postal delivery. But during my 12th year, something started nagging at me. It was March when I first noticed it, a subtle pattern that my subconscious had been tracking long before my rational mind caught up. Every 3rd Thursday of the month, without fail, each house on Elm Street received an identical package. Same size, same weight, same return address that I could never quite make out through the smudged ink. The packages were wrapped in brown paper, about the size of a hardcover book, and they always arrived on the same delivery truck from the regional sorting facility. 12 packages, 12 houses, every 3rd Thursday, like clockwork. At first, I assumed it was some kind of subscription service, maybe a book club or vitamin delivery. Small towns have their quirks, and if all the residents of one street wanted to order the same thing, that was their business. But the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. These people barely talked to each other. Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Chen from number 6 had been in a property line dispute for 15 years. The Rodriguezes kept to themselves, and the young couple at number 10 had only moved in 2 years ago. The return address was always the same, but I could never read it clearly. The ink looked deliberately smudged, as if someone had run their thumb across it while it was still wet. tried holding the packages up to the light in my truck, but the brown paper was too thick to see through. The weight was consistent, maybe 2 pounds, and they never rattled when I shook them gently. By May, my curiosity was getting the better of me. I started paying closer attention to the residents on Elm Street, especially on package delivery days. Mrs. Patterson would usually meet me at the mailbox with a smile and a comment about the weather. But on third Thursdays, she would stay inside until I left, then quickly retrieve her package. Through her front window, I could see her carrying it straight to her basement door. The same thing happened at every house. No one came out to greet me on package days. No one left their packages sitting on the porch like they usually did with other deliveries. Within minutes of my departure, I would see curtains twitch and front doors open just long enough for the packages to disappear inside. I started keeping a mental log. March 18th, April 15th, May 20th, June 17th. Always the third Thursday, always 12 identical packages. I began timing my route differently on those days, parking at the end of Elm Street where I could observe the houses after making my deliveries. Every single resident followed the same pattern. Quick retrieval, straight into the house, curtains drawn tight for the rest of the day. The breakthrough came in July when I was delivering a certified letter to Mrs. Patterson. She was expecting her Social Security documents and had asked me to bring them to her door instead of leaving them in the mailbox. When she answered, I could smell something strange coming from inside her house. It was not unpleasant, but unfamiliar. Sweet and herbal, like burning sage mixed with something medicinal. "Busy day today, Mrs. Patterson?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She looked nervous for the first time in 12 years. "Oh, you know how it is, Thomas. Just some spring cleaning." But it was July, and the smell was definitely not cleaning supplies. That evening, I drove back to Elm Street after my shift ended. Every house was dark except for a strange, flickering glow coming from the basement windows. Not electric light, but something softer, like candles or oil lamps. And if I strained my ears, I could hear a low humming sound, like multiple voices chanting in unison. I parked across the street and watched for over an hour. The flickering lights moved in synchronized patterns, and the humming would rise and fall in waves. At exactly 11 o'clock, everything stopped. The lights went out, the humming ceased, and normal house lights began turning on throughout the street. August came, and with it, another delivery of 12 identical packages. This time, I was ready. I had borrowed a small digital camera from my nephew and planned to document whatever was happening. But when I arrived at Elm Street that Thursday morning, something was different. Mrs. Patterson was waiting at her mailbox, but she was not alone. Mr. Rodriguez stood at his mailbox at number 8. The Hendersons were at number 12. In fact, all 12 residents of Elm Street were standing at their mailboxes, watching me approach. They did not speak as I delivered their packages. They just stood there, 12 pairs of eyes following my every movement. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my footsteps on the pavement and the rustle of paper as I placed each package in its designated mailbox. When I finished and returned to my truck, they were still standing there, still watching. I started the engine and began to drive away. But in my rearview mirror, I could see them forming a circle in the middle of the street. They were opening their packages in unison, removing identical items that I could not make out from that distance. That night, I could not sleep. Something was seriously wrong on Elm Street, and I had been unknowingly facilitating it for months. I decided to research the return address on the packages, even though it was barely legible. It took me 3 days of squinting at delivery labels before I could make out enough letters to attempt a search. The address traced back to a post office box in Salem, Massachusetts, registered to something called the Millfield Heritage Society. I had never heard of any heritage society in our town, and when I asked around, no one else had either. The postmaster in Salem was helpful, but could only tell me that the box had been rented for over 30 years, always paid in cash, always by different people. I started digging into Millfield's history, spending my evenings at the town library and searching through old records. What I found chilled me to the bone. Elm Street had been built on land that was once the site of the original Millfield settlement, founded in 1692 by refugees from the Salem witch trials. According to the records, 12 families had fled Salem and established a small community in the Vermont wilderness. They had built their homes in a circle and practiced what they called the old ways, away from the prying eyes of Puritan authorities. The settlement had prospered for decades, but in 1734, something had gone wrong. The official records were vague, mentioning only that the settlement had been abandoned due to crop failures and harsh winters. But I found a diary entry from a traveling minister who had visited the area in 1735. He wrote about finding the abandoned houses still standing, but with strange symbols carved into the wooden beams and scorch marks on the floors where fires had burned in perfect circles. The minister had also noted that the graves in the settlement cemetery contained no bodies, 12 headstones, 12 empty graves, and no explanation for what had happened to the families who had once lived there. By September, I was becoming obsessed with the mystery of Elm Street. I had convinced myself that the current residents were part of some kind of historical reenactment group or genealogical society. Maybe they were descendants of the original settlers, honoring their ancestors with monthly gatherings. It was strange, but not necessarily sinister. But then came the third Thursday in September, and everything changed. I arrived at Elm Street to find it deserted. No residents waiting at their mailboxes, no curtains twitching in windows, no signs of life at all. The packages were in my truck as usual, but when I stepped out to begin deliveries, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Every single house on Elm Street was identical now. Not just similar in architecture, but perfectly identical. The paint was the same shade of white on every house, the shutters the same shade of green, the front porches exactly the same height and width. Even the landscaping was identical, with the same flowers planted in the same patterns in every yard. I had been walking this street for 12 years, and I knew every house by heart. Mrs. Patterson's house had always had blue shutters. The Rodriguezes had replaced their front steps with brick ones just 2 years ago. The Hendersons had a distinctive oak tree in their front yard that was older than the house itself. Now, all of those individual details were gone. 12 identical houses, as if they had all been built yesterday using the same blueprint. I stood in the middle of the street, packages clutched in my trembling hands, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That was when I noticed the mailboxes. Each one had a name printed on it in identical block letters, but they were not the names of the people I had been delivering mail to for 12 years. Patterson, Rodriguez, Henderson, and all the others were gone. Instead, the mailboxes bore the names I had found in the historical records: Whitmore, Blackwood, Ashworth, and 9 others that matched the original Salem refugee families. I should have left then. I should have driven straight to the police station and reported what I had seen. Instead, I found myself walking up to the first house, the one that had belonged to Mrs. Patterson. The package felt heavier in my hands than it should have, and I could swear I felt something moving inside it. The front door opened before I could knock. woman stood there, and for a moment, I thought it was Mrs. Patterson. But this woman was younger, maybe in her 30s, with the same facial features but darker hair and clothing that looked like it belonged in a museum. She was wearing a long black dress with a white collar, and her hair was pulled back in a style I had seen in old portraits. "You have been faithful in your service, Thomas Richardson," she said in a voice that sounded like Mrs. Patterson, but spoke with an accent I could not place. "The time has come for you to join us." Behind her, through the doorway, I could see the interior of the house. It was not Mrs. Patterson's living room with its floral wallpaper and modern furniture. Instead, I glimpsed a room lit by oil lamps, with rough wooden furniture and herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. I stumbled backward, dropping the packages on the porch. They hit the wooden boards with a sound like breaking glass, and a thick, dark liquid began seeping out of the torn brown paper. The smell that rose from the spilled contents was overwhelming, metallic and organic, like blood mixed with rich soil. "Do not be afraid," the woman who looked like Mrs. Patterson continued. "We have been waiting for you to understand, waiting for you to see. You have been chosen to carry our messages, to help us maintain the connection between worlds. The packages you have delivered contain the essence of the old settlement, the blood and bone of our ancestors, mixed with the herbs of our craft." I turned and ran. Behind me, I could hear doors opening along the entire street, and voices calling my name in unison. Not the voices of the people I had known for 12 years, but older voices, speaking in harmonies that seemed to come from the earth itself. I made it to my truck and drove away as fast as I could. But in my rearview mirror, I could see 12 figures standing in the middle of Elm Street. They were not the residents I had known, but people in old-fashioned clothing, holding hands in a circle around the spilled contents of the packages I had dropped. When I reached the main road, I pulled over and called the police. But when they arrived at Elm Street 20 minutes later, they found nothing unusual. 12 normal houses with 12 normal residents who claimed they had no idea what I was talking about. The officers said I seemed stressed and suggested I take some time off from work. The next day, I requested a transfer to a different route. I could not bring myself to go back to Elm Street, not after what I had seen. My supervisor was understanding and assigned me to the industrial district on the other side of town. But that was not the end of it. 2 weeks later, I received a package at my own home. Same brown paper wrapping, same smudged return address, same weight and size as the ones I had been delivering to Elm Street. My name was written on it, in the same block letters I had seen on the mailboxes that day. I never opened it. I took it straight to the police station and demanded they investigate. But they treated me like a man having a nervous breakdown. The package sat on the evidence shelf for a month before they returned it to me, claiming there was nothing suspicious about a resident receiving mail. When I got home, I built a fire in my backyard and burned the package without opening it. The flames turned green when they touched the brown paper, and the smoke smelled like the herbs I had detected in Mrs. Patterson's house. As it burned, I could swear I heard voices whispering in the crackling flames, calling my name and promising that I would return to Elm Street eventually. That was 6 months ago. I moved to a different town, got a job at a hardware store, and tried to forget about Millfield and Elm Street. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the sound of packages being delivered to my door. When I look outside, there is nothing there, but I can smell that herbal scent drifting through my window. And sometimes, when I am driving through small towns on my way to work, I see familiar faces in the windows of houses I pass. faces that looked like Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Rodriguez, and the Hendersons, but wearing clothes from centuries past, watching me with eyes that seemed to know exactly where I am and what I am trying to forget. I know they are still waiting for me on Elm Street, waiting for me to understand that some routes, once walked, can never truly be abandoned. The mail must always be delivered, and some messages are too important to remain unread. Nobody wanted to talk about what happened during the lockdown drill at Cedar Falls Elementary, least of all the other school board members. But as the newest member of the board, I thought it was my responsibility to ask the hard questions. Martha Hendricks, that is my name, and I had been elected just 6 months earlier on a platform of transparency and child safety. The parents in Cedar Falls trusted me to be their voice, to make sure their children were protected and educated properly. I wish I had never opened that door. Some secrets are buried so deep that digging them up destroys everything you thought you knew about the place you call home. Cedar Falls is one of those Montana towns that exists because it has to, not because anyone particularly wants it to. 800 people scattered across a valley that gets snowed in for 4 months of the year, surrounded by mountains that look beautiful on postcards, but feel like prison walls when you live between them. The elementary school serves the whole county, bringing in kids from ranches and tiny settlements spread across 50 square miles. It is the heart of our community, the one place where everyone comes together. I had lived in Cedar Falls my whole life, raised 3 children who graduated from that same elementary school, and spent 15 years volunteering for everything from bake sales to field trips. When longtime board member Jim Patterson announced his retirement, everyone assumed I would run for his seat. I won by a landslide, mainly because nobody else wanted the job. School board meetings in small towns are usually exercises in bureaucratic tedium, arguing about budget allocations and maintenance schedules. But my first meeting in September changed everything I thought I knew about our little school and the people who ran it. The other 4 board members had all served for years. Principal Janet Morrison had been there since before my oldest child started kindergarten. Superintendent Dr. William Chen oversaw 3 small schools across the county and treated Cedar Falls Elementary like his personal kingdom. Board Chairman Robert Fitzgerald owned the largest ranch in the area and carried himself like he owned the town, too. The only other woman on the board, Susan Walsh, taught high school in the next town over and rarely spoke during meetings. Before we begin tonight's regular business, Dr. Chen announced at that September meeting, we need to review some security footage from last month's lockdown drill. He gestured to a television that had been wheeled into the conference room. Just routine documentation for our safety protocols. I had heard about the lockdown drill, of course. It had happened on a Tuesday in late August, just before school started for the year. The teachers had been preparing their classrooms when the alarm system activated, and they had followed standard procedures for securing the building. Nothing unusual about it, or so I had been told. Dr. Chen pressed play on the remote, and grainy black and white footage filled the screen. The timestamp showed August 28th, 2:15 in the afternoon. I could see teachers moving quickly through the hallways, checking that doors were locked and windows were covered. Everything looked exactly like what you would expect from a well-executed safety drill. The teachers responded perfectly, Principal Morrison noted, making a mark on her clipboard. Average response time was under 90 seconds across all classrooms. I was taking notes, trying to be diligent in my new role, when I noticed something that made me pause. "Wait," I said, pointing at the screen. "Can you rewind that last part?" Dr. Chen looked annoyed, but complied. The footage rewound to show the main hallway outside the kindergarten classrooms. Teachers were moving efficiently from room to room. But in the corner of the frame, I could see something that did not make sense. "There," I said, leaning forward. "Those 3 children in the hallway. Why are they not in a classroom during a lockdown?" The other board members exchanged glances. Chairman Fitzgerald cleared his throat. "Martha, these are just the details we work through in post-drill analysis. Nothing to be concerned about." But I was concerned. The 3 children on the footage appeared to be elementary age, walking calmly down the hallway while teachers were rushing to implement lockdown procedures. They were not running or hiding or showing any of the urgency that the situation should have demanded. They were just walking, almost casually, toward what looked like the rear exit of the building. "Who are those children?" I asked. "And why are they leaving the building during a lockdown?" Susan Walsh spoke up for the first time that evening. "Martha, these drills can be confusing. Sometimes protocols are not followed perfectly, and we make adjustments for next time. I made a note to ask for a list of all students who had been in the building that day. Something about the footage bothered me, though I could not put my finger on exactly what. The 3 children looked familiar, but I could not place them. Cedar Falls is small enough that I know most of the families, at least by sight. "I would like copies of this footage for my records," I announced. "As board members, we should all have access to materials that document safety procedures." Dr. Chen's response was immediate and firm. "These recordings contain sensitive security information. They remain in district custody only." That response raised more red flags. In my previous volunteer work with the school, I had never encountered resistance to reasonable requests for documentation. But Chairman Fitzgerald was already moving on to budget items, and my attempts to return to the topic were smoothly deflected. Over the next few weeks, I could not shake my unease about those 3 children. I started paying closer attention to enrollment records and attendance sheets, trying to identify who had been in the building that day. The official documentation showed that 12 teachers and 2 maintenance staff had been present for the drill, but there was no mention of any children. When I asked Principal Morrison directly about student presence during the drill, she seemed confused. "Students. Martha, the drill was conducted during our professional development week. No children were in the building." But I had seen them clearly on the footage. 3 elementary-age children walking calmly through the hallway while teachers implemented lockdown procedures. Either Principal Morrison was mistaken about the date, or something else was happening that no one wanted to discuss. I decided to do my own investigation. Cedar Falls is small enough that unusual events create ripples throughout the community. And if 3 children had been in the school during what was supposed to be a staff-only day, someone would remember. I started asking casual questions during my weekly trips to the grocery store, the post office, and the diner on Main Street. The responses I received were strange and inconsistent. When I asked Linda Rodriguez at the post office if she remembered anything unusual happening at the school in late August, she got a distant look in her eyes and said, "Now that you mention it, I did see some kids walking down Maple Street that Tuesday afternoon. Thought it was odd since school had not started yet." "Do you remember what they looked like?" I pressed. Linda paused for a long moment, like she was trying to recall a dream. 3 of them, I think, walking together. But I cannot quite remember their faces. Similar conversations throughout town yielded the same pattern. People remembered seeing children that day, but no one could provide specific details about who they were or where they had gone. It was as if the entire town had a collective blind spot about 3 specific kids. My breakthrough came when I was reviewing the school's enrollment records from the past several years. I was looking for patterns, trying to identify which families might have children who would have been in the building that day for any reason. That was when I discovered something that chilled me to the bone. 3 children had been enrolled at Cedar Falls Elementary for the previous school year, but had not returned in the fall. Emma Sullivan, age 7, Michael Patterson, age 9, and Zoe Chen, age 6. According to the records, all 3 had moved away during the summer with their families. But when I cross-referenced their information with county records, I found no documentation of any family moves, no forwarding addresses, and no transfer requests to schools in other districts. Emma Sullivan's family had lived in the same house for 12 years. Michael Patterson's father worked at the grain elevator and had no reason to relocate. Zoe Chen was Dr. Chen's own niece, living with her grandparents after her parents died in a car accident 2 years earlier. I called the numbers on file for all 3 families. Emma Sullivan's phone had been disconnected. Michael Patterson's father claimed he had never heard of me and hung up when I mentioned the school board. But it was the call to Zoe Chen's grandparents that confirmed my worst fears. "Zoe?" Mrs. Chen's voice was shaky and confused. "We have not seen Zoe since..." When was it? I cannot seem to remember. She was here, and then she was not. The doctors said it was grief making us forget, but we know she existed. We have her things, her pictures. I drove to the Chen house that same afternoon. The elderly couple invited me in, and what I saw broke my heart. Zoe's bedroom was perfectly preserved, as if she had just stepped out for a few minutes. But when I looked closely at the family photographs displayed throughout the house, I noticed something disturbing. In every photo that should have included Zoe, there was a strange blur or shadow, as if someone had been carefully erased from the images. "She was right there," Mr. Chen kept saying, pointing to empty spaces in photographs. "We remember her being right there." That evening, I called an emergency meeting with Chairman Fitzgerald. I presented him with everything I had discovered, the missing children, the inconsistent records, the gaps in everyone's memory. His response was not what I expected. "Martha," he said in a tone that was patient but firm, "you are dealing with a very sensitive situation that requires careful handling. Some matters are best left to those with experience in these areas." "What kind of sensitive situation involves 3 missing children and altered records?" I demanded. Fitzgerald was quiet for a long moment, studying my face like he was making a decision. Finally, he spoke. "Meet me at the school tomorrow night at 8 o'clock. Come alone, and I will show you what really happened during that lockdown drill." I should have brought someone with me. I should have called the state police or the FBI or anyone with authority beyond our little county. Instead, I drove to Cedar Falls Elementary alone on a cold October night, my hands shaking as I unlocked the front door with the key I had been given as a board member. Chairman Fitzgerald was waiting in the main hallway with Principal Morrison and Dr. Chen. The building felt different at night, shadows stretching longer than they should and familiar spaces taking on ominous shapes. "Before we show you the complete footage," Dr. Chen said, "you need to understand the history of this building. Cedar Falls Elementary was built in 1952 on land that had previously been used for other purposes. The county purchased the property from a private organization that had operated here for many years." He led me to the library, where a projector had been set up. The screen displayed a series of photographs that looked like they had been taken decades earlier. Black and white images of the same building, but with different signage and different people. From 1928 to 1951, this was the Cedar Falls Institute for Exceptional Children, Dr. Chen continued. It was a residential facility for children with what were then called developmental disabilities, but it also served as a research center for experimental treatments. The photographs showed children in institutional clothing, standing in rows in front of the building that was now our elementary school. Their faces were blank and distant, and many appeared to be heavily medicated. The institute was closed after a state investigation revealed irregularities in their treatment methods. Principal Morrison added, 23 children who had been residents simply vanished during the final week of operation. No records of where they went, no family claims, no documentation of transfers to other facilities. I felt sick as the implications began to sink in. You are telling me that children disappeared from this building 70 years ago, and now 3 more children have vanished? Chairman Fitzgerald activated the projector remote, and new footage filled the screen. This was not the edited version I had seen at the board meeting. This was raw security camera footage from multiple angles, showing the entire sequence of events during the August lockdown drill. The footage began normally, with teachers implementing lockdown procedures throughout the building. But at the 2-minute mark, something extraordinary happened. 3 children simply materialized in the main hallway, not walking in from another room, not emerging from hiding places. They appeared out of thin air, like smoke condensing into solid form. Emma Sullivan, Michael Patterson, and Zoe Chen stood in the hallway for several seconds, looking around with expressions of confusion and fear. Then they began walking toward the rear exit, their movements mechanical and synchronized, like they were being controlled by an external force. "The building remembers," Dr. Chen said quietly. "Every few years, usually during times of stress or change, the Institute reasserts itself. The children who vanished in 1951 are still here, still trapped in the building's memory. And sometimes, they take living children back with them." The footage continued, showing the 3 children reaching the rear exit. But instead of opening the door and leaving, they simply walked through it, passing through solid wood and metal like they were made of mist. On the exterior camera, there was no sign of them. They had not exited the building. They had been absorbed by it. "Where are they now?" I whispered, though I was not sure I wanted to know the answer. "They exist in the spaces between spaces," Principal Morrison replied. "In the walls, in the foundation, in the memory of what this place used to be. We have learned to recognize the signs when the building is becoming active. The lockdown drill was not a drill at all. It was a containment protocol." Chairman Fitzgerald turned off the projector and faced me directly. "This is why board positions rarely change hands in Cedar Falls. This is why certain decisions are made by people who understand the full scope of what we are dealing with. The school serves the community, but it also serves as a prison for something that cannot be allowed to spread. You have been covering up child disappearances for decades," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We have been protecting hundreds of other children," Dr. Chen corrected. "Every child who attends this school, every family in this county. The alternative is to close the building, to let whatever exists here escape into the broader world." They showed me more footage from previous years. 1998, when 2 children vanished during a fire drill. 2003, when 1 child disappeared during a severe thunderstorm. 2009, when the building claimed 3 more during a routine maintenance day. Always children who were already vulnerable, already isolated, already partially forgotten by their families and communities. "The building chooses carefully," Principal Morrison explained. "Children whose absence will create the least disruption, whose memories can be quietly erased from official records and community consciousness." "But their families remember," I protested, thinking of Mrs. Chen's confused grief. "Families remember something," Chairman Fitzgerald agreed. But memories fade when they are not reinforced by external evidence. Pictures blur, records disappear, and eventually people convince themselves they were mistaken about what they lost. I left the school that night knowing that I faced an impossible choice. I could expose what I had learned and watch our community torn apart by investigations and media attention, while potentially releasing something far worse into the world. Or I could become complicit in a cover-up that had already claimed dozens of children over several decades. The decision was made for me 3 days later when I found a manila envelope on my front porch. Inside were professional photographs of my own grandchildren, taken recently at locations throughout Cedar Falls. Attached was a simple note. Some secrets protect more than they harm. Welcome to the board. I have been keeping those secrets for 8 months now. I attend meetings where we discuss budget allocations and maintenance schedules, while carefully monitoring security footage for signs of the building's awakening. I help identify children who fit the profile of potential targets, and I participate in the quiet alterations of records and memories that follow each disappearance. Last month, we lost 2 more children during what the community believes was a routine safety inspection. Their families are already beginning to forget, their photographs already beginning to blur, their enrollment records already being quietly modified. And I sit in those board meetings, taking notes and asking the right questions, while 3 more empty desks wait in classrooms that will never acknowledge the children who once sat in them. Because in Cedar Falls, some kinds of education require sacrifices that can never be discussed in official minutes or annual reports. The building is stirring again. I can feel it in the way the hallways echo differently, in the way shadows move independently of their sources. Soon there will be another drill, another containment protocol, another careful selection of children whose absence will disturb the community the least. And I will be there, taking minutes and maintaining records. Because someone has to document the price we pay to keep the rest of our children safe from what lurks in the spaces between memory and forgetting. Every small town has that one place that stays open all night. And in Willow Creek, that was Mel's Diner. I worked the graveyard shift there for 8 months, and I thought I had seen everything the darkness could bring through those glass doors. Drunks stumbling home from the bar across the street, truckers needing coffee and conversation, insomniacs seeking refuge from their own thoughts. But there was one customer who changed everything I believed about life, death, and the thin line that separates the two. Her name was Hazel Morrison, and she had been dead for 38 years. George Patterson is my name, and I took that job at Mel's because I needed something to pay the bills while I figured out what to do with my life. 29 years old, fresh out of a relationship that had lasted too long, and tired of pretending I had my future mapped out like everyone else my age seemed to. The overnight shift at a diner in a town of 1,500 people was not glamorous, but it was honest work that left me alone with my thoughts and a steady stream of coffee. Willow Creek sits in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, surrounded by wheat fields that stretch to every horizon. The kind of place where 3 generations of the same family live within walking distance of each other, where everyone knows your business before you do, and where the biggest excitement is usually the high school football games on Friday nights. Mel's Diner had been serving the community since 1962, occupying a converted train car on the edge of downtown, with red vinyl booths and a counter that had absorbed decades of conversations and confessions. The overnight shift was typically quiet. Between midnight and 6 in the morning, I might serve a dozen customers on a busy night, mostly regulars who worked unconventional schedules or dealt with sleep troubles. I learned their names, their orders, and their stories. Coffee black for Jim Harrison, who drove the mail truck. Pie and ice cream for Mrs. Rodriguez, who cleaned offices downtown and always stopped by around 4. Eggs over easy for Danny Walsh, who worked maintenance at the grain elevator and got off work at 3. But Hazel Morrison was different from the first night I saw her. She came in at exactly 3:17 in the morning on a Tuesday in October. I noticed the precise timing because the old clock above the register had been running 7 minutes fast for months. And she entered just as it showed 3:24. She was elderly, maybe in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and wearing a blue dress that looked like it belonged in a different decade. "Coffee, please," she said, settling into the corner booth by the window. Her voice was soft but clear, with an accent that suggested she had grown up in this part of Kansas, but had lived elsewhere for a while. I brought her coffee in one of the heavy white mugs we used for regular customers. "Anything else?" "Pie is fresh today. Apple pie if you have it," she replied. "And vanilla ice cream?" I served her the pie and went back to my prep work for the morning shift. When I glanced over a few minutes later, she was sitting with her hands folded, looking out the window at the empty main street. The coffee cup was still full, and the pie remained untouched. She sat there for exactly 43 minutes, never drinking the coffee or eating the pie. At 4 o'clock sharp, she stood up, left exact change on the table, including a 20% tip, and walked out into the night. I watched through the window as she crossed the street and disappeared into the shadows between buildings. The next week, Tuesday night at 3:17, she returned. Same blue dress, same order, same behavior. Coffee and apple pie with vanilla ice cream, paid for but never consumed. She would sit in the corner booth for 43 minutes, staring out the window with an expression I could not read, then leave exactly at 4. After her 4th visit, I started paying closer attention. Hazel Morrison looked exactly the same each time. Not just similar clothing, but identical. The same dress with the same small wrinkle near the left shoulder. The same hairstyle with the same few strands that had escaped the bun. Even the same faint lipstick that had been applied with the same slight imperfection on the lower lip. "Do you know Hazel Morrison?" I asked Mel during one of our shift changes. He had owned the diner for 30 years and knew everyone in town. Mel paused while wiping down the counter. "Hazel Morrison died in 1987, George. Car accident out on Highway 36. Why do you ask?" "Someone with that name has been coming in during my shift. Elderly woman, blue dress, orders coffee and pie but never eats." Mel's expression grew serious. "What does she look like?" I described her in detail, including the specific way her hair was styled and the shade of blue in her dress. As I talked, Mel's face grew pale. "That is exactly what she looked like," he whispered. "But George, Hazel Morrison has been dead for 38 years. He disappeared into the back office and returned with a cardboard box filled with old photographs and newspaper clippings. Most were pictures from community events and local celebrations that had been held at the diner over the decades. Near the bottom of the box, he found what he was looking for. The newspaper clipping was from October 1987. The headline read, "Local woman dies in late-night accident." Below it was a photograph of Hazel Morrison, age 73, wearing the same blue dress I had seen her in every Tuesday night. The article explained that she had been driving home from a church meeting when her car skidded on wet leaves and struck a tree. She had died instantly at 3:17 in the morning. "She used to come in here every Tuesday night," Mel explained, his voice shaky. "Same time, same order. Coffee and apple pie with vanilla ice cream. But she was trying to lose weight, so she would order it and just sit with it, using the smell and the company to satisfy her craving without actually eating. According to the article, Hazel had been on her way home from the diner when the accident occurred. She had left at exactly 4 o'clock, just like she had been doing during my shifts. The accident happened less than a mile from Mel's at the intersection of Main Street and Highway 36. "Why is she still coming here?" I asked. Mel shook his head. "I do not know. But if it is really her, there must be a reason she cannot move on." The next Tuesday, I was ready. When Hazel Morrison entered at 317, I watched her every movement more carefully than before. She walked with purpose, but also with a strange lightness, as if her feet barely touched the floor. When she sat down, the vinyl booth did not creak the way it did for other customers. When I brought her coffee, the mug felt strangely cold despite having just come from the pot that was kept at 180 degrees. "Mrs. Morrison," I said, sitting across from her in the booth, "can I ask you something?" She looked at me with eyes that were kind but distant, like she was seeing me from a great distance. "Of course, dear." "Why do you keep coming back here?" For the first time in all her visits, her expression changed. Confusion flickered across her face, followed by what looked like fear. "I am not sure," she admitted. "I remember being here, enjoying the coffee and the pie. But I also remember being very tired, wanting to go home. I got in my car and then..." She paused, touching her forehead like she was trying to recall a difficult memory. "I cannot remember what happened next." "Mrs. Morrison," I said gently, "you died 38 years ago. You were in a car accident after leaving this diner." She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see recognition dawning in her eyes. "The tree," she whispered. "I remember the tree, and the rain, and the pain." Her hand moved to her chest. "But if I died, why am I still here?" That question haunted me for the rest of the night. After she left at 4 o'clock, I drove out to the intersection where her accident had occurred. The tree was still there, a massive oak that had been scarred by the impact, but had survived. Plastic flowers and a small cross marked the spot where Hazel Morrison had died. I started researching her life, trying to understand what might be keeping her spirit anchored to that Tuesday night routine. Through old phone books and county records, I learned that she had lived alone in a small house on Elm Street. Never married, no children, but deeply involved in her church and various community organizations. By all accounts, she had been a kind and generous person who was beloved by everyone who knew her. But there was something else I discovered that changed everything. In the weeks before her death, Hazel Morrison had been investigating irregularities in the church's finances. As the treasurer, she had noticed money disappearing from various accounts and had been quietly gathering evidence of embezzlement by other church officials. The night she died, she had not been coming from a regular church meeting. She had been meeting secretly with a lawyer from the county seat, providing him with documents that would have exposed a scheme that had stolen thousands of dollars from church members and local charities. Those documents were never found after her accident. The embezzlement continued for several more years until the scheme collapsed on its own. But by then, the evidence was gone, and no one was ever prosecuted. I realized that Hazel Morrison was trapped in the last night of her life because she had died with unfinished business. She had been carrying the weight of truth that needed to be revealed, and her death had prevented justice from being served. The next Tuesday, when she arrived at 317, I was waiting with a folder full of everything I had learned about her investigation and the embezzlement scheme. "Mrs. Morrison," I said, placing the folder on the table. "I think I know why you are still here." I explained what I had discovered about her final mission and how her death had allowed criminals to escape justice. As I talked, her expression grew clearer and more focused, as if she was remembering not just who she was, but why her work had been so important. "They stole from the church," she said, her voice growing stronger. "From the food bank, from the scholarship fund, from families who trusted us with their donations." "The statute of limitations has passed," I told her. "But there are still people in town who were harmed by what happened. If you can remember where you hid the evidence, maybe we can find a way to make things right." Hazel smiled for the first time since I had been serving her. "The safe deposit box," she whispered. "Bank of Willow Creek, box number 207. She reached into her purse, a movement that looked more real and solid than any other gesture I had seen her make. She pulled out a small brass key and placed it on the table. "Give this to Pastor Williams at the Methodist Church," she said. "He was not involved in the scheme. He can make sure the truth comes out, even now." As soon as she released the key, I could see her beginning to fade. Not disappearing, but becoming lighter, more transparent, like morning fog touched by sunlight. "Thank you," she whispered. And for the first time since I had been serving her, she picked up the coffee cup and took a sip. "That is perfect coffee, dear. Just the way I remember." She faded away completely at 4 o'clock, leaving behind only the key, exact change for her order, and the lingering scent of apple pie and vanilla ice cream. I delivered the key to Pastor Williams the next morning, along with everything I'd learned about Hazel Morrison's investigation. The safe deposit box contained decades of financial documents that exposed not just the original embezzlement, but ongoing fraud that had continued long after her death. While criminal charges were no longer possible, the revelations led to civil lawsuits that recovered hundreds of thousands of dollars for victims and their families. Scholarships were established in Hazel Morrison's name, and a memorial garden was planted at the church she had died trying to protect. I never saw her again after that Tuesday night. But sometimes, when I am working the overnight shift and the clock shows 3:17, I catch the faint scent of apple pie and vanilla ice cream drifting through the diner. And I know that somewhere, Hazel Morrison is finally at peace in Liette. They called me to settle a property dispute between two families who had been neighbors for 40 years, and I thought it would be a straightforward surveying job. Richard Blackwood is my name, and I've been measuring and mapping land boundaries across North Carolina for 15 years. Most property disputes involve a few feet here and there, maybe a fence that was built in the wrong place or a driveway that crosses into someone else's deed. But what I discovered in the hills outside Harmony Ridge changed everything I thought I knew about the secrets that can be buried beneath seemingly ordinary land. Harmony Ridge is one of those mountain communities that feels removed from the modern world, where families trace their roots back 6 or 7 generations, and newcomers are still considered outsiders after 20 years. The town proper has maybe 200 people, but the surrounding hills are dotted with isolated homesteads and family compounds that have been passed down through generations. It is the kind of place where people handle their own problems and view outside interference with deep suspicion. The Morrison and Fleming families had been feuding over a strip of land that separated their properties for as long as anyone could remember. According to the county clerk who hired me, the dispute had been going on since the early 1980s, with both families claiming ownership of a wedge-shaped piece of forest that covered about 3 acres. Previous surveys had been inconclusive, and the families had been taking turns filing lawsuits that went nowhere. "We need a definitive boundary established," the clerk explained when she called me. The families are threatening violence over this thing, and we cannot have that in our county. I drove up to Harmony Ridge on a crisp October morning, my equipment loaded in the back of my truck and a folder full of deeds and historical maps on the passenger seat. The disputed land sat between two similar properties, both featuring older farmhouses with extensive outbuildings and cleared fields that had been carved from the surrounding forest decades ago. Dale Morrison met me at his front gate, a weathered man in his 60s with the kind of deep suspicion of outsiders that I had encountered in other mountain communities. "You the surveyor?" he asked without preamble. "Richard Blackwood," I introduced myself, extending my hand. "I understand you and your neighbors need some boundaries clarified." Morrison shook my hand grudgingly. "Been our land for 40 years, he said. "My daddy cleared that timber himself, and them Flemings got no right to it." The Fleming property was accessible by a dirt road that wound through thick forest before opening into their main compound. Jacob Fleming was younger than Morrison, maybe in his 50s, but he had the same hardened look of someone who had spent his life working the land. "Appreciate you coming out," Fleming said when I introduced myself. "That strip of land has been in our family since my grandfather's time. Morrisons are trying to steal what belongs to us." Both men insisted on being present when I conducted my survey, which made for a tense atmosphere as I set up my equipment. The disputed land was heavily forested, with thick undergrowth that made it difficult to move around with my instruments. But as I worked, I began to notice things that seemed unusual for a natural forest. The trees were all roughly the same age, suggesting the entire area had been cleared and replanted at some point. But more oddly, they seemed to be arranged in subtle patterns, with large gaps that formed rough geometric shapes when viewed from above. My electronic distance measuring device also detected irregularities in the ground that suggested extensive digging had been done at some point. "Has this land been used for farming?" I asked Morrison as I adjusted my theodolite. "Not since I've been here," he replied. "Been woods long as I can remember." Fleming gave a similar response, but both men seemed nervous whenever I asked about the history of the land. They kept glancing at each other across the disputed boundary, and I got the impression they were communicating something that I was not meant to understand. On my second day of surveying, my ground-penetrating radar began picking up anomalies throughout the disputed area. The equipment was designed to detect underground utilities and foundation remains, but what I was seeing looked more extensive and more irregular than anything related to construction or agriculture. "There are significant underground disturbances throughout this area," I told both families when they met me at the site that afternoon. "Before I can establish definitive boundaries, I need to understand what I am dealing with down there." Morrison and Fleming exchanged a look that I could not interpret. "What kind of disturbances?" Fleming asked. "Large excavations that have been backfilled," I explained. "Multiple sites, some quite deep. If there are septic systems or old foundations down there, they could affect property values and development rights." That evening at my motel in town, I spent hours studying the radar images on my laptop. What I was seeing was unlike anything in my 15 years of surveying. The underground disturbances were extensive and appeared to follow patterns that suggested deliberate placement rather than random digging. More disturbing were the shapes themselves. Long, narrow excavations arranged in rough grids, each approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. As a professional surveyor, I had seen enough cemetery layouts to recognize what I was looking at. I was looking at graves, dozens of them, scattered throughout the 3-acre disputed area. The next morning, I called the county sheriff's office and requested that a deputy meet me at the site. If there were unmarked graves on the property, it became a legal matter that went far beyond a simple boundary dispute. Deputy Williams arrived within an hour, and I showed him the radar images. His reaction confirmed my suspicions. "Those look like burial sites," he agreed. "But there is no cemetery recorded in this area. Are you sure your equipment is working correctly?" I ran the scans again, and the results were consistent. 43 separate anomalies, all the right size and shape to be individual graves, scattered throughout the disputed land in a pattern that suggested they had been dug over an extended period of time. "We need to notify the families," Deputy Williams said, "and probably the State Archaeological Office. If these are Native American graves or historical burials, there are procedures we have to follow." But when we approached Morrison and Fleming with our findings, their reactions were not what I expected. Instead of surprise or concern, both men went pale and began speaking in hushed, urgent tones. "You cannot bring outsiders here," Morrison said. "This is family business." Fleming nodded in agreement. "Some things are better left buried." Deputy Williams pressed them for more information, but both families became increasingly evasive. They claimed they had no knowledge of any graves on the property and insisted that my equipment must be malfunctioning. That night, I received a phone call at my motel. The voice was male but disguised, speaking in a whisper that made it impossible to identify. "Stop digging," the voice said. "Leave Harmony Ridge tomorrow and never come back. This is your only warning." I hung up and immediately called Deputy Williams. He promised to increase patrols around my motel and the surveying site, but I could tell he was taking the threat seriously. The next day, I returned to the disputed land with a different approach. Instead of focusing on boundary lines, I concentrated on documenting the underground anomalies. If these were illegal burial sites, I needed evidence that would hold up in court. As I worked, I noticed that both families were watching me from a distance. Morrison stood at the edge of his property with what looked like a rifle, while Fleming paced back and forth along his fence line. The tension was palpable, and I began to understand that I had stumbled into something far more serious than a property dispute. My breakthrough came when I decided to dig a small test hole at one of the radar anomaly sites. I had brought a folding shovel for exactly this purpose, and I chose a location that was roughly in the center of the disputed area. 3 feet down, my shovel hit something that was definitely not soil or rock. I cleared away more dirt and exposed what was unmistakably human bone. A skull, partially preserved and stained dark brown from decades in the earth. But this was not an old burial. There were metal fragments mixed with the remains, pieces of what looked like contemporary clothing and personal effects. I could see a wristwatch, tarnished jewelry, and scraps of fabric that had not fully decomposed. I was looking at a murder victim, not an ancestor. I immediately called Deputy Williams and began photographing everything before disturbing the site further. But as I worked, I became aware that I was no longer alone in the forest. Morrison and Fleming had approached silently, and they were now standing about 20 feet away, watching me document their secret. Both men were armed, and their expressions made it clear that they viewed me as a threat to something much more important than property boundaries. "You should not have dug there," Morrison said quietly. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, still crouched beside the exposed grave. Fleming answered, 40 years, give or take, maybe a few more. People pass through these mountains, drifters and travelers who nobody misses. Sometimes they cause problems, threaten families, steal from decent folks. "So you kill them," I said. "So we protect what is ours," Morrison corrected. and we dispose of problems in a way that keeps our community safe. I realized that the property dispute had been a cover story for decades. The two families were not fighting over the land. They were cooperating to maintain it as a private burial ground for victims they could not afford to have discovered. "The surveying stops now," Fleming said, raising his rifle. "And you forget what you found here." Deputy Williams arrived 15 minutes later to find my equipment abandoned, but no sign of me. The test hole had been hastily filled, and both families claimed they had no idea where I had gone. It took search teams 3 days to find my body in a ravine 2 miles from the disputed property. The official cause of death was listed as an accidental fall while surveying remote terrain, despite the obvious evidence of violence. But I am still here in a way, still measuring and mapping the secrets buried in the hills around Harmony Ridge. And I know that someday, someone else will discover what the Morrison and Fleming families have been hiding in the land they never really fought over. The 44 graves are still there, waiting to tell their stories to anyone brave enough to dig deep enough to find the truth. I was supposed to fill in for the regular nurse in Riverside for just 2 weeks while she recovered from surgery. But what I discovered in that small Iowa town kept me awake for months after I finally escaped. Betty Sullivan is my name, and I have been a visiting nurse for 12 years, covering rural communities across the Midwest where medical professionals are scarce and help is always needed. I thought I had seen every kind of medical situation possible in isolated places. But Riverside taught me that some communities will go to unimaginable lengths to preserve what they consider their way of life. Riverside sits along a bend in the Cedar River, population 637, according to the faded welcome sign at the edge of town. The kind of place where cornfields stretch in every direction, where the biggest building is the grain elevator, and where 3 generations of families live within a few blocks of each other. It should have been a routine assignment. Cover the basic medical needs of a small community for 2 weeks, help with medication management for elderly residents, and assist the local doctor with whatever cases came up. Dr. Arthur Coleman had been Riverside's only physician for over 30 years, and everyone spoke of him with the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints. He had delivered most of the younger generation, treated everything from farming accidents to heart attacks, and never turned away a patient, regardless of their ability to pay. When I arrived at his clinic on a Monday morning in September, he greeted me with the warm professionalism I had come to expect from small-town doctors. "Welcome to Riverside, Betty," he said, shaking my hand with a grip that was firm despite his 70-plus years. "Martha Wilson will be back in 2 weeks, but until then, I am grateful for the help." The clinic was small but well-equipped, occupying a converted house on Main Street with examination rooms that had been added over the years as the practice grew. Dr. Coleman showed me around, introduced me to the receptionist and the part-time lab technician, and explained the filing system for patient records. "Most of our patients are families who have been coming here for decades," he explained as we walked through the facility. "You will find that Riverside folks are remarkably healthy for a rural community. We have very low rates of cancer, heart disease, and other chronic conditions that plague similar towns." That first week seemed to confirm his assessment. I saw patients for routine blood pressure checks, diabetes monitoring, and minor injuries. Everyone was friendly and seemed genuinely healthy for their age groups. But I began to notice patterns in the medical records that struck me as unusual. Every family in town seemed to share certain genetic traits that should have been much more rare. Unusual eye colors, distinctive facial structures, and physical characteristics that appeared with remarkable frequency across supposedly unrelated family lines. More concerning were the laboratory results I reviewed while organizing patient files. Blood work from residents showed genetic markers that I had never seen clustered together in such high concentrations. Not necessarily abnormal results, but unusual patterns that suggested these people shared far more genetic material than would be typical for a general population, even in an isolated rural community. "Dr. Coleman," I asked during one of our consultations, "have there been genetic studies done on the population here? Some of these lab results show interesting patterns." His reaction was immediate and defensive. "Betty, I think you are reading too much into routine blood work. Small communities naturally develop certain shared characteristics over generations. But my nursing background included genetics training, and what I was seeing went far beyond normal population genetics. These people were not just distantly related through common ancestors. They were showing markers consistent with much closer genetic relationships than anyone was acknowledging. My suspicions deepened when I began reviewing the obstetric records from the past several decades. Dr. Coleman had delivered hundreds of babies over his career, but the birth records showed patterns that made no medical sense. Pregnancy complications that should have occurred regularly in any population were completely absent. Genetic disorders that should have appeared at predictable rates simply did not exist in Riverside. Either this community had the most extraordinary genetic luck in medical history, or something else was happening that was not reflected in the official records. "I need to ask you about the fertility treatments," I said to Dr. Coleman at the end of my first week. He paused in his chart review. "What fertility treatments?" "The medication inventory shows regular orders for reproductive hormones and genetic screening supplies that would typically be used for fertility interventions. But I do not see any corresponding patient records for these treatments." Dr. Coleman closed the chart he had been reviewing and looked at me with an expression that had shifted from friendly to calculating. "Betty, you are a temporary employee here. Your job is to assist with routine patient care, not to audit medical practices." That evening, I drove through Riverside's residential neighborhoods, paying closer attention to the families I had been treating. What I saw confirmed my worst suspicions. Children who supposedly belonged to different families showed striking physical similarities. Siblings who should have been years apart in age looked like twins, and adults who claimed no family relationship could have been identical relatives. The next morning, I arrived at the clinic early and used my access to the medical records to conduct a more thorough review. What I discovered made me physically ill. Dr. Coleman had not been practicing conventional medicine for decades. He had been conducting genetic experiments on the entire population of Riverside, using fertility treatments and selective breeding to create what amounted to a controlled human breeding program. The medical files contained detailed genetic analyses of every resident, tracking bloodlines and genetic markers with the precision of a livestock breeding operation. Families that claimed to be unrelated were actually carefully selected genetic matches. Pregnancies were not natural occurrences, but planned genetic combinations designed to reinforce desired traits. More horrifying were the records of unsuccessful outcomes. Children who did not meet genetic criteria were listed as stillbirths or infant deaths, but follow-up documentation suggested they had been removed from families and relocated elsewhere. The numbers were staggering. Over 30 years, hundreds of children had been born in Riverside, but only those who met Dr. Coleman's genetic standards had been allowed to remain. "You should not have access to those files," Dr. Coleman said from behind me. I turned to find him standing in the doorway of the records room, and for the first time since I had arrived in Riverside, he did not look like a kindly small-town doctor. He looked like a man who had been caught in the middle of something unforgivable. "What have you done to these people?" I whispered. "I have created perfection," he replied calmly. "Riverside represents the future of human evolution. 3 generations of carefully controlled genetic selection, eliminating hereditary diseases and enhancing desirable traits. These people are healthier, more intelligent, and more physically capable than any normal population. They are your experiments, I said. You have been treating an entire town like laboratory animals. Dr. Coleman smiled. And now you understand why you are really here, Betty. Martha Wilson did not have surgery. She began asking the same questions you are asking, and she had to be removed from the situation. I realized with growing horror that my assignment to Riverside had not been random. I had been selected, evaluated, and brought here for a specific purpose that had nothing to do with providing medical care. You need new genetic material, I said. The breeding program is starting to show signs of inbreeding, and you need outside DNA to continue. You have excellent genetics, Betty. Healthy family history, high intelligence, and no chronic medical conditions. You would make valuable contributions to our community. I backed toward the clinic's rear exit, but Dr. Coleman moved to block my path. The people of Riverside have been very patient with your investigation, but now it is time for you to accept your role here. Through the window, I could see residents gathering in the street outside the clinic. Men, women, and children who I had been treating for the past week, all watching the building with expressions that were no longer friendly and welcoming. They knew what was happening inside, and they were there to ensure I did not leave. How long has this been going on? I asked, stalling while I looked for another exit. Since I arrived here in 1993, Dr. Coleman replied. Riverside was dying then, losing population and economic opportunities. I offered them a chance to become something special, something better than human. They embraced the vision. You mean they embraced the delusion? I corrected. These people are not evolved. They are victims of medical abuse on a scale that should be impossible in modern America. Dr. Coleman's expression hardened. They are the future, Betty. And you are going to help ensure that future continues. I broke the window behind me with a paperweight from the desk, climbed through, cutting my arms on the glass, but escaping into the alley behind the clinic. I could hear shouting from inside the building and the sound of people running toward my location. I made it to my car and drove out of Riverside faster than I had ever driven in my life, not stopping until I reached the state police barracks 50 miles away. But when the investigators arrived in Riverside the next day, they found a normal small town with a respected doctor who claimed he had never heard of Betty Sullivan. The medical records I had seen were gone. The genetic testing equipment had vanished. Even the blood samples that had shown unusual markers had been replaced with normal results. Dr. Coleman presented documentation showing that no visiting nurse had been assigned to his clinic, and the residents of Riverside supported his statements completely. The investigation was closed within a week due to lack of evidence. But I know what I saw in those files. I know what Dr. Coleman was doing to the people of Riverside, and I know that somewhere in Iowa, a genetic experiment is continuing under the guise of small-town medical care. The perfect community that never gets sick, never shows genetic disorders, and never questions why their doctor has been controlling their lives for over 30 years. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder about other small towns with beloved doctors and unusually healthy populations. I wonder how many rural communities have embraced similar visions of genetic perfection, and how many visitors like me have disappeared into experiments that continue in the shadows of American medicine. I came to Copper Hill to film their annual Harvest Festival, thinking it would be a charming, small-town tradition documentary that could help launch my independent filmmaking career. Arthur Phillips is my name, and I had spent 2 years researching unique American festivals when I discovered references to Copper Hill's 3-day celebration in obscure folklore journals. The descriptions made it sound like a perfect subject. An isolated Texas community that had maintained pre-industrial harvest traditions for over a century. I had no idea I was documenting the final phase of a ritual that had been consuming visitors for generations. Copper Hill sits in the East Texas piney woods, population 412, accessible only by a single winding road that branches off from a state highway and disappears into dense forest. The kind of place that exists on maps but feels forgotten by the modern world, where the cell phone service is spotty and the nearest interstate is 2 hours away. Perfect for a documentary about authentic American traditions that have survived in isolation. I arrived on a Thursday in late October, 2 days before the Harvest Festival was scheduled to begin. The town seemed frozen in time, with wooden storefronts that could have been built 50 years ago, and residents who moved with the unhurried pace of people who have never been in a rush to get anywhere. Everyone I met was friendly but guarded, willing to talk about the weather and local history, but evasive when I asked specific questions about the festival. "You will understand everything once it begins," Mayor Patricia Hendricks told me when I interviewed her at the town hall. Copper Hill's Harvest Festival is not like other celebrations. It is something that has to be experienced to be appreciated. I set up my equipment at the Copper Hill Inn, a converted Victorian house that served as the town's only lodging. The proprietor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Coleman, seemed nervous about having a filmmaker in town during festival weekend. "Most visitors who come for the festival do not need accommodations," she explained while showing me to my room. "They usually become part of the community by the end of the 3 days." I assumed she meant that people enjoyed the festival so much they extended their stays or decided to move to Copper Hill. Small towns are always hoping to attract new residents, and a successful festival could be good for local economic development. The first day of the Harvest Festival began at dawn on Saturday, with what the residents called the Awakening Ceremony. The entire town gathered in the central square, forming concentric circles around a raised platform where Mayor Hendricks and several other community leaders stood wearing elaborate costumes that looked handmade and ancient. I filmed everything, focusing on the intricate details of the costumes and the solemn expressions of the participants. The ceremony involved chanting in what sounded like a mixture of languages, some recognizable as variants of English and Spanish, but others completely unfamiliar. The townspeople moved in synchronized patterns, stepping in rhythm to drums that were played by children who could not have been more than 10 years old. "This represents the awakening of the harvest spirit," explained James Morrison, a local teacher who had volunteered to be my guide. "Our ancestors brought these traditions from the old country, and we have maintained them without interruption for over 100 years. But as I filmed, I began to notice details that did not match Morrison's explanation. The costumes were not folk designs from any European tradition I could identify. The symbols carved into the wooden platform were not Celtic or Germanic, but something much older and more primitive. And the chanting, when I listened carefully through my headphones, contained words that sounded more like incantations than traditional folk songs. The second day involved what the residents called the binding ceremony. This time, the townspeople constructed elaborate displays throughout the business district using corn stalks, pumpkins, and other harvest decorations to create intricate patterns that were visible from the second-story windows of the inn. From my elevated vantage point with my camera, I could see that the decorations were not random arrangements. They formed a complex geometric design that encompassed the entire downtown area, with the town square at the center and radiating patterns that extended to the edges of the commercial district. Each family contributes specific elements to the overall design. Morrison explained as we walked through the decorated streets. The pattern has been refined over generations, with each year adding new components while maintaining the essential structure. But the pattern I was documenting looked less like harvest decorations and more like some kind of containment circle, with symbols and arrangements that seemed designed to trap or control something rather than celebrate it. The geometric precision was far too exact for folk art, suggesting knowledge of mathematical principles that seemed out of place in a rural Texas community. On the second evening, I was invited to join the townspeople for what they called the Feast of Preparation. Long tables had been set up in the town square, loaded with food that had been prepared by various families throughout the day. Everyone in Copper Hill was present, from newborn babies to elderly residents who could barely walk. The food was unlike anything I had ever tasted. Rich, complex flavors that seemed familiar but impossible to identify. When I asked about the recipes, people would smile and give vague answers about family traditions and secret ingredients that had been passed down for generations. "You are eating the essence of Copper Hill," Mayor Hendricks told me as she refilled my plate. "Food that connects you to our community and our history." As the evening progressed, I began to feel strange. Not sick exactly, but altered in a way I could not describe. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds were more intense, and I felt a growing sense of connection to the people around me. Other visitors to the festival were experiencing similar effects, laughing and talking with residents as if they had known each other for years. "The food helps newcomers understand what Copper Hill is really about," Morrison explained when I asked about the unusual sensations. "It opens the mind to possibilities that might otherwise be rejected." That night, I reviewed the footage I had shot during the first 2 days of the festival. What I saw disturbed me more than I could rationally explain. When I watched the ceremonies through my camera, the participants looked different than they had appeared to my naked eye. Their movements were more mechanical, their expressions were blank and distant, and their costumes seemed to be made of materials that shifted and changed texture as I watched. More disturbing were the visitors like myself. In the footage, we appeared to be in various states of transformation, our faces becoming more similar to the residents and our movements becoming more synchronized with the group activities. I looked at my own reflection in the inn's mirror and saw subtle changes in my features that had not been there when I arrived. The third day was called the Harvest of Souls, and I woke up knowing that I needed to leave Copper Hill immediately. Whatever was happening during the festival was not a cultural tradition, but something far more sinister and supernatural. But when I tried to pack my equipment and check out of the inn, Mrs. Coleman informed me that leaving was not possible until the festival concluded. "The roads are closed during the final ceremony," she explained with a smile that no longer looked friendly. "Everyone who participates in the Harvest Festival must see it through to completion." I discovered that my car keys were missing from my room, and my cell phone had stopped working entirely. The other visitors who had arrived for the festival seemed unconcerned about these developments, apparently accepting that they would remain in Copper Hill for as long as necessary. The final ceremony began at sunset in the town square, with all the residents and visitors forming a massive circle around the decorated platform. Mayor Hendricks began chanting in the unknown language I had heard during the previous ceremonies, and the entire crowd responded in unison with words I somehow knew, despite never having heard them before. As the chanting continued, I began to understand what was really happening in Copper Hill. The Harvest Festival was not celebrating the agricultural harvest, but harvesting something else entirely: the identities, memories, and souls of visitors who were drawn to the community. The geometric patterns created with harvest decorations were not folk art, but a massive ritual circle designed to trap and transform anyone who participated in the 3-day ceremony. The food served during the Feast of Preparation contained substances that made visitors susceptible to the transformation process. And the final ceremony was designed to complete the harvest by absorbing newcomers into the collective consciousness of Copper Hill. I could feel my individual identity dissolving as the chanting reached a crescendo. My memories of life outside Copper Hill were fading, replaced by a sense of belonging to something ancient and hungry. The other visitors around me were undergoing the same transformation, their faces taking on the blank expressions I had seen in my camera footage. But some part of me, the part that had spent years behind a camera lens documenting reality, remained separate from the collective experience. While my body participated in the ritual, my consciousness retreated to a space where I could observe what was happening without being completely consumed by it. I watched as the festival concluded with all the visitors fully transformed into residents of Copper Hill, ready to help prepare for next year's celebration and the new harvest of souls it would bring. I saw myself smiling and shaking hands with Mayor Hendricks, accepting my permanent role in the community, while some deeper part of my mind screamed in helpless horror. The documentary I had intended to create was never completed, but the footage still exists somewhere in the collective memory of Copper Hill. Every year, during the Harvest Festival, that part of me that remains separate watches new filmmakers and researchers and curious visitors arrive in town, drawn by the same obscure references that had brought me here. And every year, I participate in their transformation, while desperately hoping that one of them will prove strong enough to escape with the truth about what really happens when small towns maintain traditions that are older and hungrier than anyone wants to believe.